Hey friends, we are back in After Effects and are going to look at a few more transformation tools. So I've just set up my composition. Remember, we are using the HDTV 1080 25 frames per second setting, and I'm just going to start by selecting my pen tool and creating a shape layer or a shape that we can animate. So I'm going to stick with the triangle, and this is now my geometry that we will be working with today. So it appears as a shape layer, which is what all of your geometry should be, and inside that we can see that there is a path, which is great. So with the path, the first thing that we're going to look at, which we covered slightly in the last tutorial, is the normal transforms that we can see down here, and I'm going to look at maybe just position first. So remember, when we're animating we need to turn on our stopwatch, and that creates our first keyframe. Then you move your handle to the second keyframe, and this is where your storyboard comes in, letting you know at what time things should happen. And I'm just going to again change these numbers to move my triangle to the right place on the stage. So then again, when I come back to the first keyframe, press spacebar to play, that will move along to the second keyframe. Alright, and then maybe from this keyframe here I want to start animating a rotation. So I'm going to turn on my stopwatch for rotation, and you can see it's created my first keyframe. And then over the next 1 second I would like that to do a full 360. So I feel like I can just press 1 in this rotation and it should do a 360 there. So you can see as I move that along, we bring that right up to 1 times. That's 1 full rotation. But you may have noticed that while this is rotating, it's actually off the screen, and we can see, if I click on my shape, that the anchor point for this triangle is actually way over here, quite far off my actual geometry. So I'm going to move my anchor point into the center and just move this around until my anchor point is right on this baseline here. So you can see I've matched that up in this area. Now that's going to make my animation slightly different. So it's actually moving my triangle off the stage. So I'm going to come back in and adjust my position. So when you're changing your keyframes, just make sure that they're selected, they're yellow, and that means you'll be moving those values. So I'm going to reposition my triangle, move back over so I can see the geometry at this point. Again, click on your keyframe that you want to change, and I'm going to move that back in. Now what has happened here, this is actually great. So what has happened is that my handle wasn't exactly on the keyframe that I was changing, and it's seen this as sort of a point C, like a new keyframe of animation. You can see on the stage that it will have gone right off and then come back to this point C. So I can just select that, make sure it's yellow, press delete, and line my handle up. So when you're altering things, just make sure that you're zoomed in enough to have this red line crossing that keyframe that you want to change. So there we go, I can move that back. I can hold shift to get it in the same line that it used to be, or I can just line that up with my eye. So then we should have an animation. If I press spacebar, it moves across the stage, and then it does a 360. Cool, so that's pretty good, but you can see halfway through I still have the point of this triangle heading off the stage, so I might add in a scale. You can actually move through these keyframes by holding wait, I gotta figure out the format for PC. So you can move through these keyframes frame by frame with your arrow keys by holding Control and pressing the arrow keys. So that might help you kind of align up your keyframes. I'm not too sure what the shortcut is on Mac, but you can play around with either maybe Control, Alt, or Shift, and one of them should do the same thing. So right here, when we start our rotation, I'm also going to start scaling my triangle. So again, the same process. We click on our stopwatch. We have our first keyframe created for us, and I want to make sure that at this point in my animation, the point of the triangle is staying on the stage. So I'm just going to create my keyframe here so I know what size I need to get my triangle to. This size, and we'll see how that shrinks as it's animating. Then I think I want to make it a little bit smaller so it almost looks like it's disappearing. So I'm going to move into around this time on my timeline and make that a wee bit smaller again. So now we can see if we press play, it gets even smaller, and then as soon as we hit that full rotation, I want it to be pretty much non-existent, so I'm going to stick that on 0. You can also type this in, which I should have been doing. So here we go. If I just move out, we have this animation, and my triangle has disappeared. So of course it's out of view because we have used the scale to make it 0%, but the shape layer is actually still on our stage. So if I wanted to just make sure that that geometry actually ended, even though it's invisible, it's still actually on the stage, I'm just going to hover over the end of this layer on my timeline, and the little arrows appear, and I can actually click and drag that right here, and that means that the geometry layer will actually end as it disappears. So you can line those up like that, and then if I have my geometry selected so you can actually see it, when it reaches the end of this animation you can see that the path or the outline of the dots, it actually disappears, and that's because the layer has ended there. So that is the basic animation from your transform tool. We're going to move on a little bit and talk about color changing. So we have an Effects and Presets tab over on the right hand side here. I'm just going to pull this up into the side of my stage so you can see a little bit more of the elements that we can play with. So we're going to look at changing color. So this is going to be under the color correction, or is it? Yes, it's going to be under the color correction tab, and to change the color you can use change color, or you can use your color balance or channel mixer. Any of these will give you the same sort of outcome but using a different way to change the object. So I'm going to go ahead and use my color balance, and this is HLS, that means hue, lightness and saturation, and they are the things that you can use and change, and you can apply that to your object on the stage, or you can apply it to the layer on the timeline. So as soon as you click and drag one of these effects over onto your layer, it gives itself an effects tab underneath. So if I just bring that up, and then down here on the timeline you can see we can change the hue, the lightness or the saturation, and you can do that in exactly the same way as we used our transform selections, or you can head to the effects controls tab. Now that is sometimes hiding behind the project tab where we have our geometry stored. So within the effects controls tab you kind of get these dials, and you can play around that with a little bit more visual help, and I think sometimes that's a little easier than just working with numbers down here. So we can animate that exactly the same. I'm going to turn on my stopwatch, and you can see down in the timeline it's highlighted that, turned that on, and given us our original keyframe. Then I'm just going to move along until the point in the animation where I want things to change. I'm going to open up my transform tools so I can zoom in and line it up on those keyframes. It's looking pretty good. And then I simply move this color wheel around until I get the hue that I want it to change to. So you can see as we animate, it's going to move through all of these colors. So if you're looking at changing from one specific color to another, you may have to do some sort of smaller animation, so looking at moving your keyframes very close together, or using a different one of these color correction tools to actually get that effect. So I'm going to go from purple to green here, and if I move back to the beginning, deselect my geometry and press spacebar, you can see it's cycling through those colors and then it stays green as it fades out. So that's the same with the saturation. We can pop that animation on, we can say okay, it's fully saturated now, and I want it to stay fully saturated while it's changing color. So therefore I will hit the insert keyframe button here. That's right in the middle of these two arrows, and that again just copies, it kind of puts the keyframe at whatever's happening on the stage at the moment. So because nothing's changed between our first saturation keyframe and where we are now, it's going to just be exactly the same settings as that first keyframe. So I'm going to add in a keyframe there, and then from this point on I want that to desaturate until it disappears. So right at the end here, I am going to make the saturation -100. So at the front, I'll deselect this and it changes color, and then, oh, you can vaguely see it desaturating here. So full saturation, and then just down in here it starts to get a bit grayer. So that's pretty great. So there are lots of other tools, and you can just sort of play around with the effects and presets. Don't get too crazy. There are a lot of strange ones in here, but again there are a lot of ones that you will recognize from Photoshop. So things like levels, the hue and saturation, shadows, highlights, curves you may have played with before, and channel mixer and things like that. So brightness and contrast as well. So there, you can pretty much do most of the things you can do in Photoshop, except here we can turn on our stopwatches and we can add the keyframes to actually animate those qualities. So the next thing we might look at is let's see, we can use the blur and sharpen tool. So a few of you may have seen Matt's example that was shown in the lecture, and I've had a few questions on how to actually like copy that effect. Some of the ways you can do that, or one of the ways you can do that, is by adding a blur and animating that out. So in the blur and sharpen tab we have the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to add that to my layer, and under the effects tab you can see the Gaussian blur occurring, and here in the effect controls area we have that at the same time. So when you animate this and you animate the blurriness of it, what can happen is you can actually ramp up that blurriness so much that your shape actually starts to disappear. And you can see if we keep running this up higher and higher and higher, the whole shape sort of blends or fades out. And you can imagine adding some sort of transparency, so looking at changing our opacity down as it blurs out, and that would achieve that sort of fading. So if we play that, you can see how that sort of just fades out or blurs out into this big sort of coloured splodge. So you can go a little further with your blurring than you may have imagined in Photoshop. I might take that off for now, and we'll have a look at actually changing geometry. So potentially I can go from this triangle to a circle. So the way we do that is actually by affecting the path, and this is why when you bring your geometry in from Illustrator, we want to make sure that we have this path here that we can change. So at the moment, this path is static, it's our triangle, but we can animate that as well. So I'm going to turn on my stopwatch, and now we actually have the option to change the path. So I'm going to head to my 2-second mark again, and now when we grab our selection tool and we click on our path, we can actually go in and, well, if I can click on it properly, hang on. Oh, that should be the one. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I have my points back now, and we can actually skew them out. So you can see if you wanted to change this into something else, you can grab your pen tool and you can add more points and just sort of mold this into the shape that you wanted your triangle to change into. You can convert them just like you can do in Illustrator, so I can turn that into a curve. So I can bring some of these out, which will be handy if I'm making some sort of curved shape, and move them further out. So I may have added a few too many vertexes. You can also, wait, nope. So what just happened there was I tried to delete one of my anchors that I'd put in, but this was one of the first anchors, and that anchor is needed at the starting point because the animation we've already put on the frame is kind of tied to the geometry at the start, so you can't delete your original anchors. Actually, we might just leave it like that, but you can see how we can go in and you can change each of these vertexes, or vertices, that's the word, and mold them into the shape that you want to create. So as long as you're keeping those starting anchors, you can pretty much make anything, and you can add in new ones. So from here to here, you can see how all of those sort of combine. Now, I'm going to leave this as our shape, and if you wanted to duplicate everything that you've done, you can go up to Edit and Duplicate, and that will give you exactly the same animation. So I can actually select this layer as a whole, move it upwards, and you can see that path. You can still see that the animation that we've put into this original one is still heading in the same place. So if you wanted to move all of your animation at the same time, if I just undo that, you would need to select your position, and you would need to lift that up. So the position is one thing that you may get a little bit messy when you're trying to duplicate things, because you really need to make sure that all your position keyframes are selected when you click on your layer. You can see if I just click on the top name, those keyframes aren't yellow. So if you just highlight position and then move your geometry, you can actually move those things around as a whole, and then we get two things doing the same thing at once, and that could be quite useful. So on that note, I'm going to introduce you to a very, very useful tool, which is called Repeater. So when you have your shape layer highlighted, I'll just get back to the start there, up here in the top toolbar you have a little add section, and under there you can see that we can add an ellipse, and that will create an ellipse. And you can add all sorts of other geometry if you wanted to with your shapes. I'm just actually going to where are we up to? Shape 1, ellipse path. I'm going to delete the ellipse path. And instead of adding that, I am going to move right down and add a repeater. So what the repeater does is it gives you a little option in the contents area, and it duplicates your geometry. It still keeps all of the animation from the other things that we did, but you can see that it's just duplicated the geometry inside of that. So you can choose how many copies you want to fit. You can choose the offset, which is how close or far apart they're going to be duplicating from your original. And you can transform those as well. So the position is going to be how far they are apart from each other, whereas the offset is how far apart the first one starts from your original. And you can spread them out a little bit. You can scale the copies, and because we're talking in terms of copies, what happens with the scale is that it scales it from the previous copy. So the first one is 100% here, the second one is 106% of the first one, and then this one is 106% of the second one, and on and on. So when you're creating your copies, it's not going to scale linearly, it's going to scale in an upwards trend. So then we have the rotation, and you can get them to rotate all the way around, and you can imagine if you're animating, this is kind of exciting to see them spiraling like this. And you can also animate the start opacity. So if we had them kind of spiraling off in this sort of direction, and if we were animating the start opacity, you can see that the start would fade in, and if we animate the end opacity, you can imagine that as we go from here to here, and I bring the end opacity right up, you can see that as we animate, they get stronger and stronger. So you can actually turn off both of those opacities and have them fading in as copies, which is really pretty great. So the repeater is going to give you a lot of options in terms of moving things around in a circle, maybe around your anchor point, so we can change the anchor points of these. You can't really see my example very well, but what I will do is I will put a tutorial specifically on the repeater underneath this tutorial on Blackboard, so that you can play with that. If your position is at 0, I wonder if I can just scale out a little bit. Maybe I will just scale everything down so we can see what we're looking at. So you can see how here, if I move it up, we start to form a ring around our original point, and although they are that's moving because my entire animation is now moving, but if we just play with the rotation, you can imagine them spiraling out and forming this ring around my anchor point, which is in the center. Yeah, so I will put a specific repeater tutorial underneath so you can have a look at that in more detail. But in this add column, there are lots and lots of different things you can do. We can round the corners, so this is if you wanted to turn your triangle into a perfect circle, you would use the round corners idea, and you can change the radius of that. So if I just move you a little closer to the triangle, we can see that as I pull this radius up, it will smooth the corners of that geometry, and you can change that fully, I think. So in combination with, that's weird, I wonder if it only works on squares. So you can round the corners, so that might help if you're looking at going from some sort of smooth curvilinear form to really sharp points, and showing that contrast between the order and the chaos. And you can also add a pucker and bloat, which does really interesting things. You can see that here we start to look at all of these little segments sort of that become, well, don't do things like this, but from spikes to maybe a triangle to maybe a sort of more curvilinear looped blobby form. So pucker and bloat is quite fun to play with. And there's also wiggle paths maybe could be useful. So that sort of, you can see the outlines of this, and in animation you could make them move, so grow in size, and basically let's just see if we can animate this one for you. I'll turn on the size and I'll turn on the wiggles per second. So we'll just change the size, give it a little bit more, and wiggles per second, and move that down a little bit. So you can see you can see how those paths on the side of the triangle are sort of wiggling and moving about. So there are a lot of things you can do here in After Effects with very simple transforms from this path, and looking at things perhaps in distort if you wanted to look at some rippling effects. The transform will give you a few more options than the transform that we have here. So you can look at skewing if you wanted to, let's just see, if you wanted to skew your shape, like kind of stretch it out a little bit. And there is the option to, actually we won't play with these, but you can use the transform as an actual effect on top if you needed to do anything really exciting. There's a spherize, and so we can look at, let's just see, can we do this here? Is that going to work for me? There we go. So you can choose where the center of the sphere is going to be, and depending on the radius you can sort of blob that out as if it was on the side of this 3D shape. And there's a lot of different things, but I think to begin with, just maybe stick to the color and the opacity, and just playing with these normal transforms down the bottom. And we will get into actually more effects in maybe a week's time, looking at how you can just sort of polish your animation and maybe look at some of the a little bit more complex work in After Effects.